Welcome to the very first episode of Bigfoot for Breakfast, home of the mysterious and the macabre, where we sit in the basement every week challenging conventional thought. On this show, we'll be covering... On this show, we'll be covering a wide array of strange topics, everything from conspiracy to shadow people. We are your hosts,
Samantha Carter
and Sarah Jones. Today's topic is one that I've long been interested in, so we thought it fitting to cover it first and foremost. Just get it out of the way.
I want to specify that she's the one that's been interested, not us, just her.
I did say I.
I know, that's what I'm offended.
Oh, you also are interested.
Let's not draw attention to that fact. Anyway.
I understand.
It's just you. Only just you.
The event itself is perplexing, and even stranger are the theories that come of it. Just when you think one theory fits, you'll think of a million reasons why it doesn't, and the fact that there are 0 witnesses to help piece it together isn't very helpful either. The more information that you hear, the more the mystery tends to deepen. Investigators and armchair detectives alike have spent years and years of their life trying to figure out what happened that night in the Ural Mountains of Russia. Of course, we're talking about the true story of 9 hikers who took that ominous trip through what is now known as Dyatlov Pass, otherwise known by the indigenous Mansi tribe as Kolirin, or Mountain of the Dead. I want to take this opportunity to excuse our pronunciation of many of these words and names.
We do not have sophisticated tongues.
That's what she said. I also want to take this moment to point out that if you were going to hike a treacherous trail up a mountain peak by way of a pass, I feel like I wouldn't choose the mountain called Mountain of the Dead.
To be fair, you could also refer to Mount Everest as the Mountain of the Dead, considering many of the hiking checkpoints are actually dead hikers' bodies who are still up there.
Is that a thing?
That's a thing. There's a guy with a coat. They just use their bodies as landmarks and move right on.
It's convenient, though.
Yeah. Take a left at the guy with the yellow coat. This all started on January 28th in 1959 as 10 students who were experienced hikers from the Ural State Technical University in Russia, led by 23-year-old student of engineering Igor Dyatlov, were set to hike the Ural Mountains by way of a large pass. They were trying to reach the peak of Otorten.
Otorten.
Sorry. Rootin' or Torten, good time.
Rootin' or...
Dyatlov was an elite skier and hiker, and also the person who assembled the group of his friends from college, all of whom were also very familiar with hiking harsh terrains. The trek was planned to take 16 days, and they would cover 190 miles of snow-covered mountain incline. And from what I gather, this is a Category 3 journey, which is the highest difficulty within this mountain range. As the group began to hike toward the mountain itself, not even getting to the backcountry yet, one of the hikers got sick and had to turn around and go back home. Subsequently, he was left behind, thus leaving 9 people in the group to hike on without him. This man's name was Reuben, and he may arguably be one of the luckiest men on Earth, because those who were there to send off these young people on their journey would be the very last people to see them alive.
The 9 remaining hikers were to hike the peak of the mountain and reach their destination by February 12th. At this point, they should have reached a village here, and they were to send a telegram back to confirm that they had made it and that everything was okay. This had been prearranged by Dyatlov with his sports team back at the college, and with Reuben, the guy who had to go back home after he got sick. So they were fully expecting to receive word of a successful hike. But this time period came and went, and a postcard was never received. They waited just a bit longer, thinking that he may have reached his destination more slowly than anticipated, but another week passed with no word from Dyatlov. So on February 20th, an assembled search and rescue team made up of teachers and fellow students was dispatched to try to find the hikers and assist them to safety if possible.
The search team knew that a snowstorm had gone through this area of the mountain, so they somewhat expected that the hikers were off course, and in fact the site was found off to the west of their course on the slope of a mountain that the indigenous Mansi tribe called Death Mountain. It appeared to the searchers that the hikers were hit directly by the storm. Obviously, this would dramatically decrease their line of sight, and instead of moving toward Otorten, they deviated west and seemed to set up camp right in the middle of the valley, which was odd because you would think that they would have camped in the nearby forest in order to gain more coverage from the storm. It's speculated that maybe they were so unaware of where they were for sure, they may not have realized how close they were to the natural shelter of the trees. Maybe they wanted to practice camping on the slope, or practice camping in less favorable conditions, or maybe they simply did not want to lose altitude by moving back down the slope. It's also known that temperatures on the night of the storm were extremely cold, reaching -25 to -30 degrees Fahrenheit.
So upon arriving to the campsite, the searchers have described what they saw as gruesome, terrifying, and inexplicable. There seems to have been one tent that was shared by all 9 campers. It kind of looks like one of those large tents where you run a rope and lay a big canvas over the rope and stake it down. They were holding the tent sides up with their skis that they used during the day. It looks to have had an entrance on each end where the flaps of the tent were secured with a knot to keep it closed. Oddly, the wall of the tent was found to actually have been cut open from the inside, which leads a person to think that they were in a hurry to get out. Even stranger, most of their clothes, supplies, shoes, and everything were left behind. So they abandoned the safety and warmth of the tent and each other to wander out into the desperately cold night with nothing but extremely minimal clothing between them. As we talked about before, the weather on this mountain is nothing to mess with. We're talking sub-zero temperatures and feet of blowing snow. Ain't nobody going out there without shoes on, unless of course they have to in a hurry. There were, however, 9 sets of footprints leaving the site of the tent and no sign of catastrophic event at the site. Some were noted to only be wearing their socks, a single shoe, or were completely barefoot. No hikers or remnants of hikers were found at the site. The search team then returned to the college and alerted the police, and at that point, the investigators and even the Soviet army got involved trying to find them. We should also note that their diaries were found and that there were no entries made after January 31st, only a couple of days into the hike. This is where the mystery begins and the search continues.
It wasn't until February 27th, nearly 1 month after the hikers had departed on their journey, that the first of the bodies were found. The remains of Yuri Durashenko, Yuri Krivonishenko, Igor Dyatlov, and Zenaida Kolmogrova were discovered approximately 1.5 kilometers, or for the folks here in America, that's about 0.93 miles northeast of the campsite by a group of Mansi natives who had set out with dogs to assist in finding the missing party. Now, since there was some suspicion that the Mansi natives... Now, since... Why do I keep doing it?
Maybe you just say now like that.
I spend too much time with cats. Now, since there was some suspicion that the Mansi natives, who were local to the mountain and considered the mountains to be spiritually symbolic, were possibly involved in the disappearance of the hikers, although I'm not sure why this is, because several times throughout our research it said that there were only 9 sets of footprints from the hikers and no other people or signs of any other people recently being in the same area were found, you would think that there would have been some in-depth testimony recorded regarding the findings of the first bodies, but that is not what happened. For some odd reason, only 2 of the Mansi searchers who found the bodies had testified to what they found. In the criminal files for the case, this is what was reported by the searcher.
While looking carefully around the area, Mikhail noticed something dark close to a cedar tree. There was a flat area next to the cedar, and on this were remains of a fire. About 2 or 3 meters from the fire, they found Yuri Doroshenko, frozen without his clothes and with his hand burned. And a little to the side, they found Yuri Krivonishenko in the same state. Under Doroshenko's body were 3 or 4 cedar branches, all of about the same thickness.
A student from the same search party also stated, next to the bodies was a fire. Nearby were more than 10 small fir tree branches cut with a finished knife. The lower dry branches, of about 5 centimeters in diameter, had been cut from the cedar. Some of these were lying next to the fire, and the snow around was trampled. So, the bodies were found next to a large cedar tree, off of which many of the lower branches had been cut with a knife for a small makeshift fire. Most of the snow in the area was trampled, so it seems like they had done a lot of running around to get things done to start this fire, which would be crucial for their survival in the weather that they were experiencing.
As far as the official records of the condition of these two bodies, it was stated that Krivonoshenko's right leg has no footwear. On his left foot, there's a brown sock, and it's torn. Another sock like this was discovered half burnt next to the fire. On the backs of his hands, the skin is torn, and between his fingers there is blood. The index finger is also torn. The skin of his left shin is torn and covered in blood. Portions of his skin from his right hand were found in his mouth. He had burns on his left leg and on his left foot. There are no more visible injuries on his body. He was found lying on his back, facing upward and slightly to his left.
Doroshenko is wearing woolen socks on his feet, and over these socks, he's wearing another pair of lighter socks. His ear, lips, and nose are covered in blood, and on his left hand, his middle finger is also covered in blood. He had burns on his foot and on his right temple. He was found facing downwards into the snow. Foamy gray fluid was found in his mouth and on his right cheek, indicating an inner chest trauma from a fall or something crushing his chest, but there were no outward signs of trauma noted. Also, despite this, and the fact that there was significantly less urine found in the body than the vast majority of hypothermia cases, the death was ruled hypothermia.
It's also said that the position of the bodies in which they are found wasn't the same as when they were killed. The areas of rigor on the bodies do not match their positions, indicating that they were laid down next to each other post-mortem. It's speculated that a killer did this, but I wonder if their friends were present with them at the campsite and placed them this way before they left the site out of respect for their fellow hikers. We know that there was likely more than just these two people at the second makeshift campsite because, as the police captain stated in his report, we found various garments next to the fire rather than on the bodies, but we didn't find any other bodies, and the trees near the fire had been cut with knives, but we found no knives with the bodies.
And from the statements of others, we got this information. Maybe with the help of others, they had made a pretty good fire with the branches of fir trees, but that fire had been alight for maybe an hour and a half. For about 20 meters around the cedar, there was evidence of young fir trees being cut with a knife. We saw around 20 cut branch stumps, but we didn't see any of the cut branches left, except for one. It isn't possible to imagine that they were used to maintain the fire, because first of all, they are not good firewood. And second, around them were quite a lot of dry twigs and materials, so it's speculated that they would obviously have used the dry material first before trying to burn wet green wood in a fire. The volume of work done here in making this number of cuts suggests that there were far more people here than only these two.
So from this we can conclude, in short, that it is thought that all or most hikers ended up at this second campsite, cutting trees and trying to get warm with the minimal clothing available that they brought with them. But only 2 of them ultimately perished here, and although there were minimal injuries to the bodies, the cause of death isn't immediately obvious, and the smaller injuries could easily have been inflicted while trying to quickly gather wood, using knives in the dark. It's safe to assume that the others left the site after the deaths of these 2 men, and very well may have respectfully laid them together and taken some of their clothes to divide among them for survival. But where were the others? And why did they choose to leave this area? If they didn't die before the others left, why did these 2 decide to stay?
Beyond this, the cedar tree that was the closest to the fire had even more branches broken. All of the lower branches were completely broken off, and these were very thick. It was said that these would have been extremely difficult to break, even if you hang on them with the entire weight of your body, and some of them were actually 4 to 5 meters high off the ground. The side of the tree facing the slope and the tent was completely cleared. The branches were not used on the fire as they would have been very wet and young. Some of them were lying on the ground, and others were hanging on lower branches as if someone had created a viewing hide facing the side of the tent from where they came. So what were they watching for that they needed to hide from? It was said in another article that some of the branches of this particular tree were partly broken up near the top, indicating that someone may have climbed in order to look back at the camp. These people went to a great deal of trouble and effort to gather wood, not for fire, but for protection and shelter. This is a pretty good indication that this wasn't environment related, but something had driven them from their tent, scaring them enough to cut their tent open to escape more quickly without feeling that they had time to gather the necessary supplies that they needed for going out into the night on that mountain slope in a snowstorm. All 9 people were less scared of quickly freezing to death than they were of whatever made them leave.
Later the same day, about 300 meters from the site next to the cedar trees, Igor Dyatlov was the next to be found. His head was facing toward the tent, and he was lying face up with clenched fists folded over his chest, and an unbuttoned fur vest that was recognized as belonging to Krivonishenko. His body was covered in various minor scrapes and bruises, but he had no internal injuries. One strange thing is that he had extensive bruising on the metacarpophalangeal joints of his hands, and this is most common in hand-to-hand combat with another person. He was ruled to have died of hypothermia.
Zenaida Kolmogorova was discovered 630 meters from the site by the cedar tree, also with her head toward the tent and wearing minimal clothing, and also covered in minor scrapes and bruises. And once again, since there was a bit of suspicion that the Mansi tribe had been involved in this, they performed a rape examination, and it was found to be negative for any kind of sexual activity prior to her death.
Rustam Slobodin was found on March 5th and was face down, head toward the tent, covered in 50 centimeters of snow. Slobodin's situation was a little bit different because he was much more well-dressed than everyone else who had been found. Maybe because he had used clothes from the others after they had died, and he experienced much more trauma. He had several scrapes and bruises on various parts of his body just like the others, but he, like Dyatlov, had deep bruising on the metacarpophalangeal joints on both hands as though he had also engaged in some sort of hand-to-hand combat. He also had a fracture on the frontal bone of his skull. His death was ruled to be the result of hypothermia. It is said that his injuries were caused by the last-minute agony of a dying man from hypothermia, but it is staunchly argued that these injuries are not consistent with what are seen in the vast majority of these situations, and are indeed quite the opposite.
Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin were not found near each other like the first 2 were. They were several hundred meters apart from each other and scattered between the tent and the site of the cedar tree camp. 2 months would pass before any more members of the party were found when a Mansi native was walking his dog and came across some cut branches that seemed to trail away from the tree that they were cut from. He followed them along until they came across a pair of black sweatpants with the right leg cut off, and then a piece of a woman's brown sweater. Soon after this, the rest of the bodies were discovered, and this was on May 5th.
It looked as though the remaining 4 hikers had found a ravine and built a sort of den in order to protect themselves from the weather and the wind. This seems to show that the team was of sound mind at this point, and actively doing the right things to try to survive their situation. They brought cedar branches into the den and laid them on the floor to keep themselves off the cold ground and minimize body heat loss.
So this is where things get weird. Weird. The previous bodies had some unusual things about them that weren't really explained by hypothermia, and didn't seem to offer any explanation of why they left the tent in the first place. Some of the last 4 bodies had significant damage in the form of crush injuries. It was reported that they were crushed with immense force comparable to a high-speed car crash with no sign as to what could have possibly crushed them. They had clothing on that were proven to have belonged to some of the previously deceased members of the party, so it's assumed that they had taken them off of the other dead bodies to help themselves stay warm. But they didn't use all of them. Some articles of clothing were found outside in and around a large cedar tree. Another strange factor is that the bodies weren't even found in the den. All of them were found outside and around it, as though they had attempted to abandon that shelter as well.
Ludmila Dubinina was found on her knees with her face and chest pressed against a rock. She was decently dressed in much of the clothing that she had gathered from the other deceased hikers. All of the tissue around her eyes, eyebrows, and left cheekbone is gone. Her eyes are both gone. Her nose is forcefully flattened to her face. Her tongue is gone. The majority of her ribs are broken, and a massive hemorrhage is noted in the right atrium of her heart. Some theories regarding her missing tongue are that obviously it was eaten by an animal post-mortem, but her stomach was found to be full of coagulated blood, which leads people to speculate that her heart was beating and she was not yet deceased when her tongue was removed, and this was not done post-mortem. Her cause of death was hemorrhaged into the right atrium of the heart, multiple fractured ribs, and internal bleeding. Pretty far cry from hypothermia. Rape examination results were also negative, so like the others, she was not sexually assaulted in any way.
Kolevatov and Semyon Zolotaryov were found in a somewhat spooning position, slightly downstream from Dubinina. Semyon's body was examined next. His eyeballs are missing. He has missing tissue around his eyes and face. His tongue was intact. He had flail chest and many broken ribs noted on his right side. He was sufficiently dressed for survival, and oddly, he had a camera around his neck.
Yuri Yudin, he was the hiker that became ill before we got into the backcountry and had to go home. He heard of this camera and he was really surprised. When the group was taking inventory of supplies prior to the trip, there were only 4 cameras, one of which was Semyon's, and all 4 of these were found in the tent. Not that it's out of the question that Semyon may have brought a second camera with him, but it wasn't in the inventory for what was going. He used one camera every day, and this is the one that was found in the tent, and now the second camera is found, that he made sure to grab in an emergency exit from the tent and bring with him. The biggest disappointment about this camera, though, is the water had damaged all of the film to the point that nothing could be extracted from it. He was also noted to be holding a writing pad and a pen in one hand with absolutely nothing written on it. So I thought this was weird. It looked as though when they found the tent that the campers were going to bed. They even said in one of the articles that the stove was turned on, as if they had been cooking dinner and 2 of the sleeping bags had been left out or laid out onto the ground like they were getting ready to sleep. So why would he have had these things on him at that time?
Maybe he just left them in his pockets.
They were hanging around his neck. Like, these cameras are big. They're not like...
Oh, the camera, yeah, but like the notepad. I was thinking like the notepad stuff. But yeah, why would you think to grab a camera if you're panicked? As far as their pattern of injuries, Semyon and Ludmila's were extremely similar in direction and force, even though they had 2 extremely different body types. This means that it probably wasn't one singular uniform force that caused them. They both had multiple broken ribs, bleeding and swelling in their lungs, and bleeding into their heart, which indicates huge crush injuries that happened while they were alive. But all of the soft tissue of both of their chests was completely undamaged, significant internal injuries with no external signs. This has been compared many times to the type of trauma that is seen from a shock wave of a large bomb. It's thought that they both lived 10 to 20 minutes after whatever type of impact hit them. Oh, and they both tested positive for much larger than normal amounts of radiation, where the other bodies did not. I'm not talking about radiation that's sometimes found occurring naturally in the earth. I'm talking extremely high levels, even after the bodies had been lying in a cold water stream for a couple of months.
Personally, I feel that this could be done by nothing other than a shockwave of some sort. What do you think? I mean, both the injuries, the large force, the crushing injuries with no external signs, and the presence of radiation kind of...
The presence of radiation really kind of ties it up in a neat little bow, because really, what else could cause it? Mm-hmm.
I feel like there's no other way to go. So Alexander Kolevatov was also fairly well dressed. The waistband of his sweater and the lower parts of his pants tested radioactive. Large parts of the skull bone is exposed and the nose is flat against his face. He has an open wound behind his ear, neck deformities, and it's speculated that his injuries may have been caused by a fight. And some of the bigger conspiracy theorists state that this is a common type of killing taught and caused by people involved in the special forces. Broken neck and blow behind the ear.
And the broken nose.
Yeah.
The upward thrust with the palm.
You watch too much Con Air.
Lastly, the body of Nicolas Thibault Brignol was slightly further downstream from them, well-dressed, and was the only one wearing shoes. It's thought that when the group cut themselves out of the first tent, maybe Nikolai was already outside of the tent, and this is why he appears much more prepared and intentionally well-dressed than the others. He was wearing 2 watches on his left arm when he was found. He had multiple skull fractures, and this is the extent of his injuries, other than some minor bruising. He was lying on a rock when he was found, and in the autopsy, they excluded that an accidental fall onto the rock could have caused the injuries that he sustained. The extent of his head injury was compared to an automobile impact at high speed. There was no outward damage to the soft tissue of his head, despite the extent of the fracture he sustained to his skull. So, As far as internet research is concerned, these are the facts as we know them. The mystery of this incident has never been solved, but as you can guess, there's plenty, and I mean plenty, of theory and speculation. My favorite is aliens.
So there's another theory. This is just one that I found searching the web. But there's another theory of a missile. It was about a 30-mile wide crater noted on satellite images. A guy found it and put it up on the internet. It's located about 3 kilometers from the actual site of their tent. So he described that upon closer examination, it looked as though it had kind of turned the rock to red type glass. And so this indicated that there was a high heat impact. So he concluded that this would cause obviously a very bright light and a shock wave to go down through the pass. So imagine being in the snow in an open pass in a tent, and there's a bright light and a large shock wave that just suddenly hits your tent. He said that this would be very disorienting and extremely scary. So this would cause them obviously to run from the tent. So maybe that is why the military didn't want to admit it later.
Aliens.
I'm not saying it's aliens. But it's aliens. One of the first things to be questioned was the radiation on the clothing from some of the hikers. Why would some of these people be exposed to high levels of radiation dust in the middle of nowhere in the Ural Mountains? There was an interview conducted with one of the lead investigators on the scene of Dyatlov Pass, and he's now 94 years old during the interview, but he also seems to still vividly remember all of the details. In this interview, they discussed that there was said to be a nuclear test field in another republic, but that a moratorium was called in 1958 between the USSR, the USA, and Great Britain, in which nuclear testing wouldn't happen during this year and in the next few. So it's speculated that the USSR decided to secretly violate the moratorium, surprise, surprise, and go on testing their nuclear weapons in the isolation of the Ural Mountains, where there's no inhabited areas close by. This seems to be neither confirmed nor denied by nuclear specialists within the Russian government.
It's possible that they were testing different kinds of weapons. It's really not out of reach.
So there actually was rumors that there was a test field in the Ural Mountains. They didn't really say where, but they're thinking that this may have something to do with the disappearance as well. That maybe they were testing nuclear weapons out there, and this caused the chaos that ensued.
And it's also possible that the USSR collaborated with aliens to test new weaponry in the field of psychic warfare.
I mean, we will get into the
reptilians?
Yes. Good God.
Jeez,
not
Louise.
Come up with it. So we'll also get into...
I didn't know what you were trying to get at.
Yes. So we'll obviously get into more of the reptilian agenda and their involvement in various governments. Again.
That was on purpose.
Later on in a different episode when we feel more comfortable exploring that with you.
In this same interview, the former investigator is asked why repeated examinations of the scenes weren't carried out after the snow had melted, as this would seem to be common sense to later search for any further clues as to what had happened there that may have been covered up by the snow. He was also asked why there were no radiation tests conducted at the site to try to determine why some of the deceased had tested positive. To this, he answered that he and his fellow investigators had planned to visit the site one more time with soldiers accompanying them after the snow had melted away, and even included it in their investigation work plan. And then nothing came of it due to not having the proper permits to be on the mountain. When they pushed this, they were told to turn the case over to the deputy federal prosecutor for investigations and write their closing statement.
Close it up.
We tried to argue that we can't close it yet. There are 9 dead bodies that have to be answered for. You can't handle the truth. They were told to close it nonetheless. He and his partner intended to close the case temporarily and then reopen it when the necessary permits to investigate the mountain were obtained, and to that, they were also told no, to keep it closed and tell the parents that it was an accident.
And to not elaborate any further.
The investigator indicated then that he understood that there was something strange about the case and felt that it had been intentionally taken from them without them wanting to close it. He felt that in any other situation, they would have been told why this was happening, but they weren't. He states that he got the impression that their superior had gotten orders from the Procurator General or higher, and all work on the case was just shut down. In his long practice, he had never before or never after seen or heard of this happening in any other case, only Dyatlov.
Okay. As far as another theory, several times throughout the research, it was mentioned that the Mansi tribe was suspected of involvement in the disappearance of the hikers. Everything from the Dyatlov group entered a sacred cave nearby that contained spiritual items of the Mansi tribe, and that the tribe hunted them down and killed them. I don't like this theory. I mean, for the simple fact that there was only 9 sets of footprints. There was no other indication that there was other people there, and no evidence of a brutal murder. There was no outward signs of injury. It was also stated that the Mansi tribe would be involved indirectly because they had a system of hanging and drying mushrooms for spiritual enlightenment journeys on the lower branches of some of the cedar trees around the area. It's rumored that the Dyatlov group got into these mushrooms and
Basically kicked the shit out of each other.
they did. Also, it is rumored that they may have drank reindeer pee,
Reindeers love mushroom.
especially these mushrooms. And so there's various other things out there related to the Mansi tribe that I just don't care for, I guess.
I would like to point out the holes in the theories that would require the indigenous people to have access to radioactive materials. But I love the idea of presenting a theory of radioactive reindeer. Let's talk.
Feel like we're taking this too far.
You can never go too far. As you can probably guess, there are a lot of controversies surrounding this very odd case, and even more as far as theories, especially during the time of enormous political tension between many countries when paranoia ran high during the first years of the Cold War. The unexplained radiation on 2 of the bodies and some details regarding the lives of some of the hikers fueled a large amount of speculation and directed many people to the opinion that Western intelligence was somehow involved in the tragedy, which I wouldn't put it past the Americans to introduce a race of radioactive reindeer.
I feel like we get blamed for everything.
I feel like we deserve it sometimes.
Semyon Zolotaryov, remember he was one of the hikers with radiation. He was a 37-year-old man who joined the students last minute. It was found that he was a veteran who fought for the NKVD, which was basically a Russian secret police force, and he had years of combat experience here. And apparently, he wasn't really well known by the others. He was, like I said, a last-minute person to join, and Dyatlov was reluctant to let him come just for the simple fact that they didn't know him.
Kolevatov had worked as a lab assistant in a top-secret atomic scientific facility in Moscow. The facility had no name and was known only as P.O. Box number 3394.
Krivonoshenko worked for a nuclear facility in Russia known as Mayak, where a major nuclear disaster occurred that was close in severity to Chernobyl.
Which kind of legitimizes the theory of radioactive reindeer. I'm just going to keep pushing it. It's happening.
Like I need you to explain the legitimate angle.
Disaster, radioactive leakage, reindeer eat radioactive mushrooms, campers eat radioactive reindeer pee. Boom.
Why was it on their clothes?
Because they were high and decided to bathe in it?
No.
I think that's fair.
Realistically, though, all of these connections to secret government work in Russia can't be a coincidence.
There are no coincidences.
It's important to note that all documents and information regarding the Dyatlov Pass incident went straight into classified archive, and they weren't unsealed for years. Also, they closed down the pass to civilian hikers for 3 years after the incident. I suppose I can't say that closing down the pass to civilians, though, is super strange, because it almost seems reasonable to do this for safety reasons, and the fact that evidence continued to be found for a long time after the incident. I mean, 9 people mysteriously perish in one area. It seems logical to maybe keep people away from there for a while until they can be sure that people aren't in a huge amount of danger.
And that they don't keep finding evidence that the government has to cover up.
It also seems reasonable to think that they wouldn't have wanted anyone up there figuring out what really happened, especially if authorities were trying to cover it up.
Oh, you can cut my improv line there.
Dun, dun, dun.
Redundant. When this information about these 3 particular hikers came about, a theory developed that other members were in the dark about any political objective, and that one or more of the 3 aforementioned was to deliver radioactive samples to CIA agents in the mountains and to photograph the spies. So which ones were the spies? Who are we thinking are the spies?
American spies. They think that the Russian hikers were Russian spies meeting with American spies to betray Russia, basically.
So if they were meeting, why were they supposed to be, what were they photographing? Why were they photographing spies if they were friend spies?
I don't know.
It's speculated that something went wrong and the CIA agents realized that they were being double-crossed. Oh, so they were pretending to be spy friends, and then they were also spying on their spy friends. And then the CIA agents found out that the Russian spies were spying on them as their spy friends, and they killed them.
A double-cross situation.
During this time, there were almost 0 limits on torture and retaliation within the government, and that is exactly what happened, my friends. The group was tortured, and then all of them were killed. In another source, it was said that the surviving man who left the group before it got to the woods was astonished at the amount of cameras found at the site, because there had been many, many more. He reported that almost all of them brought a camera, but only 5 were found. Maybe they were taken by the CIA agent?
Another theory states that the group was mistaken for escaped prisoners from a gulag prison located only a few miles from where they were hiking. Gulag prisons and concentration camps were in use during World War II, and after the reign of Stalin ended, everyone was released. But in the past, prisoners had escaped and gone into hiding in the mountains for years, so it would have been easy for them to still be hiding and not be aware that Stalin had been killed and that they were free. They would still be thinking that they were basically seen as unwanted witnesses to things that happened in the camps and at war, or the hikers were discovered by escapees who killed the tourists so as not to be discovered themselves. But again, no other footprints. Puts me in the same boat of disbelief.
Radioactive mountain men.
Yeah, that's what they are.
Precisely. Riding reindeer.
Get a hold of yourself.
One of the most interesting things about that night is that there was apparently another group of hikers located 30 miles south of the area who reported a strange, bright orange light to the north of them on the mountain in the night sky on the evening of the incident. I also read in more than one source that the bodies were reported to have orange skin and gray hair when returned to their families, although we're not really sure what happens to a person's body or what it would look like after being significantly frozen for such a long period of time and then thawed. So you would expect some strange discoloration, realistically.
As reported in the Mysterious Universe website in 2008, tourists claimed to have found a big piece of metal at the site. This was 3 by 3 foot, and only this year it was located and retrieved. It was taken to the Dyatlov Foundation, and it has been determined that the piece of metal is part of a rocket fuel tank. Remember, there was a theory that the Russian military was conducting tests in the area, which wouldn't have been unreasonable to believe. If a missile crashed and contained radioactive cargo, it could seem possible that it killed and contaminated the hikers. This would also explain why the higher-ups in investigation would seem so eager to close the case. Were they following orders from the government in order to quiet the incident or cover it up the best they could?
So it was a radioactive accident? Interestingly enough, the case was actually reopened this past February, and from the get-go, investigators stated that they didn't have any more information necessarily, but that they were relying on both information from the friends and family of the deceased and also modern technology that wasn't available to investigators at the time of the incident to generate more leads and hopefully come up with a more satisfactory conclusion. It seems as though this is in response to the still overwhelming pressure from the public and from the families for an answer, and the fact that both entities are still so adamant that they are absolutely certain that something is being hidden from them. To me, though, it seems like investigators are going into this with a totally closed-off mindset. They still maintain that nothing was hidden and that they are 100% certain that they will conclude the deaths to still be connected with a natural phenomena. In March, a range of experts and rescue workers flew into the site and conducted 9 different examinations as well as a forensic probe in order to fill in some of the blanks.
Now, I want to throw in also that there are 100 articles about the reopening of this case that are dated in February. But I could not find any articles where a conclusion was met.
Actually, 100?
Close. It may be inflated. But either the investigation is still open and they're still kind of checking things out, or they just kind of didn't finish it up.
Cover up.
I also wanted to throw out there that another man had a theory about something called Kármán Vortex Street, which is a wind phenomenon that would have produced loud, horrifying noises. And it seems like the way he describes it, it's straight line winds that hit the pass. And the way this pass was shaped, it would have been uniquely situated to maybe create a perfect storm. So as the straight line winds hit the walls, they create a series of small tornadoes, which cause a really, really, really high-pitched sound. And he thinks that maybe this is what frightened the hikers away from their tent and caused them to run away. And they may have ran in different directions, and if it kept going, then it would have caused the damage to their bodies. But I feel like this wouldn't have explained the no soft tissue damage and the extensive internal injuries.
Yeah. I concur.
Now, we did mention that there was a UFO theory, and this is pretty limited. There's not a lot of people who really think that a UFO is involved, but there is a group that do believe that there is a UFO involved, but it seems like the only evidence that they really have that points to this is that the cameras that were found in the tent, they were not ruined, and the photos are developed. So there's one photo in particular that is basically a black photo, and to the left of the photo, there's a series of white lights. But behind the white lights, there's kind of like the lines. It's lines. Almost the lights are in movement. Like it's showing movement of the lights. So this is basically the only basis that they really have for believing this. I'm not sure how far I really will go down that rabbit hole.
Like a black and white photo of them even running away from a fire or explosion.
I mean, anything.
Form.
I mean, It really could be anything. It's an orb.
We're gonna fight.
So, that's all I got for theories.
By all means, if anybody else has any of their own theories, especially regarding aliens
or reindeer,
send us an email, Facebook message, comment on our Facebook page. I'll take Instagram comments. I don't care.
There are various ways to contact us.
All the ways. It seems very unlikely that we will ever know what truly happened in the mountains of Russia that night, and as unnerving as the facts of the incident are, the unknown is even more so.
9 young, able-bodied, experienced adventurers going into the mountains for a long hike and never again returning home, and unnatural and explainable ways in which they died, with the simple and yet very dissatisfying closing statement on the case to be that their deaths were caused simply by forces that they were unable to overcome.
For anyone who's interested in diving further into this case, we would encourage you to visit www.dyatlovpass.com. The people here have obviously spent a lot of time gathering information, and what I found incredibly interesting is that they have photos that were found on the hikers' cameras posted on this site. So for anyone who's willing to throw yourself just a little further down the rabbit hole, this is a great place to start.
So this has been our very first episode with many more to come. We really hope that you enjoyed it. If you enjoyed it, please press the subscribe button on whichever podcast platform you are listening from and listen to us every week. We'll be putting up new episodes every Tuesday. Check out our listener poll and give us your opinion at www.bigfootforbreakfast.com. After you've heard a few episodes, please don't forget to rate us and comment on the show on iTunes. These are the things that will help keep the show going and let us know what you think, because for real, we want to know what you think. On top of that, word of mouth gets you a really long ways, so if you really like the show, tell a friend.
Invite all your Facebook friends.
And your family.
Thank you so much for listening to us, and we hope you stick with us.